And so today is the day in the life of the Christian church, the day to let out all the stops and rejoice. For Christ has risen. Christ has risen indeed. Somehow in the power of God, he got up. Somehow in the power of God, he was raised from death unto life. Somehow in the power of God, he lives. So the end is not death, but life. That is the stunning proclamation of this Easter morning. God has triumphed. God has triumphed over all things, and not even suffering or death can defeat God's purpose of redeeming his creation. And so let us rejoice this day. Let us lift up our hearts in great praise. And yet I wonder, should we rejoice today? I mean, if we truly understood the resurrection, I wonder if we would. And do we understand? Even after hearing the story year after year after year? I mean, we have so tamed the power of the resurrection that perhaps we don't get it. I mean, for many believers, the resurrection has more to do with the reproductive capabilities of chickens than it does the power of God. For other believers, it has become simply a celebration of the natural cycle of flowers to spring up every spring, and not a celebration of the most unnatural event imaginable. And the resurrection has also been tamed by restricting it to something that has to do only with the end of life, life beyond death, not seeing the power for life now, life before death. Chances are we may not understand truly. But what exactly are we to understand? Well, Matthew tries to tell us by saying that whatever happened early on that first Easter morning, it was an earth-shaking, earth-quaking event. That to be near that tomb was to experience an earth-shaking power that left the guard struck dumb and the women disciples terrified. Matthew doesn't give any details about the resurrection itself, because really there were no eyewitnesses to the resurrection. The only categories in which he can speak about it are power and emotion. Something so powerful happened, he says, that the first reaction of those who heard the proclamation was terror, fear. Now yes, Matthew does mention joy as well, but it was almost lost in the fear. It was a mixture of fear and joy, but mostly fear. And so maybe the most appropriate emotion today is not joy, but fear, because then we begin to understand. I mean, imagine for a moment what it must have been like for both the women disciples and the men disciples in the hours after the crucifixion and on into Saturday. They all would have been in shock, of course, lost in grief, felt numb and empty, and more than once, one of them would have said, "I just can't believe it. Can't believe that he's dead." The men disciples, however, would have also been struggling with guilt. Their guilt over having abandoned Jesus when he needed them most, running away in order to save their own skins. But perhaps sometime Saturday afternoon, another feeling would have come to many of them. A feeling too powerful and guilt-ridden to give voice to. A feeling of relief. Relief that it was over. Following Jesus had turned their worlds upside down, had cost them nearly everything, endangered their very lives. Their businesses were in shambles, their families were struggling to survive, and in some cases, their families were torn apart by what Jesus had demanded of them. And their own religious life had been turned on its ear, so leaving them with few certainties to find comfort in. But now it was over. So they could return to their lives, try to pick up the pieces. and establish some sense of normalcy again. And so, relief. They'd always have their memories of him, of course, and plenty of stories to tell. And maybe by Saturday evening, they started to tell the stories about him, like we always do at such moments. But what would have been so striking about it is there had been no mention of resurrection. There would have been no word at all about resurrection, even though Jesus told them to expect it. Like many good Jews of the day, they believed in the resurrection of the body, but they believed that it would occur only at the end of the present age, when God would judge creation and remake it into a new creation. At that point, all believers who had died would be raised to life. All those who had been kept safe in the hands of God would receive a new transformed body and be part of God's new creation. What they couldn't believe is that in the present, a single individual might be raised. For those first disciples, the truth is the only certain guaranteed reality was death. And death had claimed Jesus, like it claimed everyone sooner or later. And there was no point kidding themselves about it. They knew what the world was like. And even in that, they found strange comfort. There were limits. Things began and things ended. Nothing lasted forever. Death had the last word, and so all they could do was return to the lives they had known before and hold on to their memories. Death actually gave them permission to stop following and start living again, as they once had. And if you can understand that, you can understand what the resurrection did to their lives and to their worlds. It rocked them to the very core, set them to shaking and quaking, because the resurrection meant it wasn't over. God had launched his rescue operation at last. It was just beginning, and he expected them to be part of it. Jesus was alive and had gone on ahead of them to Galilee, and that meant that they were to follow him, keep following him, and that they could never go back to what had been normal for them. They would still be in danger. They'd still have to live as if death wasn't the end. They would have to go on without him, being with them like he had once been with them. They were going to now have to be him to others. Maybe even suffer like he did, but be brave and strong. And it's no wonder then that they were afraid. And yet the joy, the great joy as well. That mixture of fear and joy. Fear, because he was alive. Joy, because he was alive. And what happened beyond that first Easter? Exactly what they were afraid of. They became 10 times the people they were before the resurrection, as someone else has put it. Because Christ lived, they lived. Because the risen Christ came to live in them, and they in him, they found themselves living with more courage than they ever thought they could, risking themselves in a way they never believed they would be able to do, living with more love than they ever dreamed they had within them. In that power, they found new abilities, new strength. Because he lived, they never again lived what you might call a normal life. They lived as if death could not defeat them, that if it wasn't the end, and that there was nothing more important than loving God and the other. They lived with a new purpose, new hope, and finally their joy of living like that overcame their fear of living like that. Now, if you still don't understand, think about it like this. Someone has suggested that we imagine ourselves to be like a house. Now, we've lived in this house for 30, 50, 70 years and more. And we've grown quite comfortable with this house over the years. The rooms are familiar and inviting, the furnishings rather pleasant, and pretty much as we want them. We are satisfied with much of what we have done to this house and feel rather good about it. Of course, there are one or two things we've never really liked about the house. Perhaps it needs another bathroom, or closet space, or a larger kitchen. And by this time, some things have started to go wrong and need repairing. Maybe the plumbing needs reworking, or maybe the roof needs a little re-shingling. So we make a few notes on what needs to be done, and a couple things we want expanded in the house. And we give them to a contractor and hire that contractor. Not a lot of work, but enough to make the house a little more comfortable and livable. So the contractor comes in and starts to work. And at first, yeah, we understand what he is doing. He follows our directions and he gets the drains right and redoes the roof. Then he begins remodeling, and we're pleased with the progress we see. But then he starts to do all sorts of things that don't seem to make a lot of sense at all. He knocks down the walls all over the place, and he pours foundations for additional rooms. He raises the roof and changes the appearance of the house. He even starts to cart off our comfortable furnishings so that he can redecorate according to his taste. Instead of following our plans, he follows his own plans. It's as if he himself intended to come and live in the house. And that's the earth-shaking power of the resurrection. Just as the risen Christ came to live in those first disciples, so he intends to live in us and make us his house. But that requires some major remodeling, because he wants to make us 10 times the people we are, 10 times the hope and courage, faith and love. So he's going to follow his plans for us, not our plans for ourselves. Big plans that call for refurnishing us with new thoughts, new wants, new emotions and wills. Plans so big they cannot possibly end in bewilderment or defeat or even death. That's the fear of it. That's the incredible joy of it. So, should we rejoice this day? Well, I guess that depends. Depends on how much we want to be 10 times the people we thought we could be and help God rescue this shipwreck of a world, this shipwreck of a nation. Trust me, there are more than enough people in this land of ours who are 10 times less than what they could be and should be. 10 times less truthful and kind and loving than they could be and should be. 10 times less human than they were created. God doesn't need any more of those people. He doesn't need people who are part of the problem, who are the problem. What God needs, what our culture desperately needs, are people who are part of the solution, are the solution. People who are at any age, willing to undergo a little remodeling, some interior redesigning, some refurnishing, and through whom the kingdom draws near. He lives. It is truly the most frightening proclamation ever, and truly the most joyous.